Is it? Yeah, you can see my screen now.
No, not yet.
Not yet. Sorry. Share. Okay, now.
Yes, if you want a full screen, it's
Yeah,
better.
yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, dear colleagues, dear friends, my name is Huang. I'm a researcher from Mobi Research Center in Free University of Brussels. My topic today is data visualization for reaching consensus in the multi-actor, multi-criteria analysis. Mobi Center focused on supporting and studying the transition towards a more sustainable mobility and logistics systems. The multi-actor, multi-criteria analysis, MOMCA, is an essential decision-making methodology for supporting sustainable logistics and mobility. In this presentation, I will present to you what is MOMCA, how does it work, why we face the consensus reaching problem, and how do we tackle this with different data visualization. MOMCA is a multi-criteria decision-making methodology that allows for the inclusion of multiple stakeholders. Stakeholders are people who have an interest, financial or otherwise, in the consequence of any decision taking. In MOMCA, multiple stakeholders can be invited for the evaluation of their stakeholder group to evaluate a set of alternatives. Different stakeholders group can have unique criteria traits that concern their interests to evaluate a set of alternatives. This picture illustrates the MOMCA framework. It consists of 7 steps: define alternatives, stakeholder analysis, identify criteria and weights, define criteria indicators, overall analysis, result discussion, and implementation. Unlike classic multi-criteria analysis, MOMCA involves stakeholders after defining the alternatives. The stakeholders analysis is conducted, stakeholders are identified, and the criteria tree for each of them can be constructed. In step 5, overall analysis, each stakeholder group will apply MCA to generate the alternative ranking. It should be noticed that any MCDA method can be used to assess the different alternatives such as HP, Promote, and Electron. This method gives each stakeholder group the liberty of having their own criteria, weight, preference structure, and only at the end of the analysis, the different points of view can be confronted. To better elaborate the MOMCA framework, a case study of the CityLab project is introduced. CityLab project is an EU Horizon 2020 project. The CityLab objective is to develop knowledge and solutions that result in upscaling and rollout of strategies, measures, and tools for emission-free cities logistics in urban centers by 2030. In this project, stakeholders meetings were held in the CityLab cities to test out the CityLab solutions. The goal of the local stakeholder meetings in the 7 CityLab cities was to have local actors assessing whether the other tested CityLab solutions would be a good options for their city or not. They were asked to allocate weight for different criteria and to evaluate the alternatives based on the criteria. During the evaluation, MOMCA software worked as an interactive tool to evaluate alternatives and visualize the result. Here, we will take the Oslo case as an example. Here we can see the 6 alternatives with different characteristics: e-freight bikes and microhomes, online shop and use of spare capacity, last mile carrier and electric vans, common logistics in shopping center, urban warehouse and electric vans, integrated reverse logistics. To evaluate the alternatives, 5 stakeholder groups were involved in the local stakeholder meeting. They were receiver, shippers, shopping center owner, society, and the transport operator. Each stakeholder group had different criteria for the evaluation. In this project, Promote is used to evaluate the alternatives. To quickly recap Promote, the preference ranking organization method for enrichment evaluation is an outranking method in MCA. Let us consider a set of criteria to evaluate a finite set of alternatives. To compare the preference of 2 alternatives, AI and AJ, on criteria FK, we define a preference function From the right side, you can check the 6 standard functions. After comparing the preferences between the alternatives AI and AJ for every criterion, the global measure of the preferences AI of AJ can be computed, where WK is the weight of the criterion of FK. Weights are assumed to be positive and normalized. The probability ranking is based on the positive flow score, negative flow score, and the net flow score. For probability 2, which was used in the Mumka case, is based on net flow score phi. The procedure comes to an end by calculating the net outranking flow for each alternative and completing the ranking. The maximum amount of net flow denotes the best alternatives. After a stakeholder group evaluated all the alternatives, in step 6 of Mumka, the result of different stakeholder groups are illustrated in the multi-actor view. The different color lines stand for different alternatives. You can find different alternatives that act differently for different stakeholder groups. The stakeholder group have different preferences, no doubt as they are clustered because they hold different interests. However, there is not a final ranking of alternatives for all stakeholder groups as they manage different criteria, and the sum of performance scores from different stakeholder groups will reduce the individual information. Sometimes in Mumka, it is hard for the stakeholder group to reach consensus, as the stakeholder groups have different rankings of the alternatives. A discussion is needed between the decision makers and the stakeholders to reach a consensus on the final solution. However, as the stakeholders hold different objectives and preferences, a final consensus is sometimes hard to reach if the individual rankings are widely divergent. As a consequence, a solution is sought to assist the decision makers to identify one or a few candidate solutions to reach a consensus. Thus, we started the work on identifying the consensus among the stakeholder groups. We try to find a consensus based on the use of a weight sensitivity analysis model in the context of the probability method, which is based on inverse mixed integer linear optimization. Weight sensitivity analysis is proposed in decision making to assess the stability of the ranking. From this formula, we can know that in probability 2, the final net flow of one alternative is based on the net flow of every criterion respecting to its weight. So by turning the weight, the final result of one alternative can be changed. However, when using the conventional weight sensitivity analysis, weight stability intervals, only few alternatives can be ranked first. This method only focuses on one criteria at a time. Changes are assumed to be applied uniformly to the other criteria in order to remain normalized. To consider multiple weights of criteria at one time, the problem for reaching a consensus in Mumka can be formulated as what would be the minimum modification that should be accepted by the different stakeholder groups such that a common alternative would get a higher position in the different rankings. The objective is to minimize the modification of these new weights compared to the initial ones, which we call the weight distance set. It can be applied in the Mumka methodology to offer a consensus between different stakeholder groups by taking a inverse optimization point of view. We applied mixed integer linear optimization to the CityLab projects. Here, 2 indicators are introduced. That is the weight distance, which is the modification of weight allocation that leads to the change of ranking. O is the rank distance, which is the deviation of the ranking position of one alternative to the top ranking. For example, for the alternative e-freight bikes and the microhomes, the ranking distance O and the weight modification Z for all stakeholder groups are listed. The capital O and Z are the sum of weight distances and the ranking distances from all stakeholder groups. We can say that as the weight distances Z increasing, the ranking distance O is decreasing. When O is 0, which means all stakeholders will rank these alternatives top. After MILP is applied to all 6 alternatives, we get the sum of ranking distance O with the changes of weight distance state. Special attention needs to be paid to the alternatives, urban warehouse and the electrical fence. The final ranking distance is 4, which means even the maximum weight modification is applied, not all stakeholder groups can rank these alternatives first. To find the possible consensual solution of the case, Pareto efficient solutions are found by treating the result as a set of unsorted data. The figure shows the full milk result of case outthrough. Y-axis represents the rank distance of alternatives, which is O, and the x-axis represents the weight distance state. The lines with markers illustrate the rank changes of the alternatives with the weight modification. The gray semi-transparent line is the Pareto frontier connected by the Pareto optimal solution. It is observed that all alternatives except urban warehouse and electrical vans can rank first among all stakeholder groups in the end, but with different weight modification. Alternatives, common logistics in shopping center and integrated reverse logistics both cover part of the Pareto optimal solution, while integrated reverse logistics rank well originally before weight modification. Common logistics in shopping center can rank first with smaller weight modification. Thus, these two alternatives are selected as consensus options. We would like to inspect the consensus result from different perspectives. Thus, more data visualization are proposed in two perspectives, stakeholder group and alternative. To dig into the detail of the ranking change of the alternatives in stakeholder group, the ranking step table is listed. From this slide, you can find the detailed weight change of the criteria of stakeholder groups receiver to rank alternative integrated reverse logistics. When the rank distance is 1.072, the alternatives can be the top choice for the receiver group. We put weight modification of all stakeholder groups for one alternative into the chart. The ranking step chart are generated. The ranking step chart shows the weight modification detail for each stakeholder until the alternatives rank top. Here, the ranking step chart of alternatives common logistics in shopping center and integrated reverse logistics are shown. From the previous chart, we know these two alternatives both cover part of the Pareto optimal solutions. We can see all the stakeholders can rank common logistics in shopping center with smaller weight modification. After investigating the detail of stakeholders, we try to focus on the performance of alternatives when changing the same weight. Thus, we built a table called the delta table. 3 indicators are introduced. Delta is the weight modification applied to all stakeholder groups. I1 is the number of stakeholders who rank one alternative first when applying delta value weight modification. I2 is the number of stakeholders that would have modified the weight to rank one alternative first when applying delta value weight modification. For example, when the weight modification is 0.059, there is one stakeholder that ranks online shops and use of spare capacity and freight bikes and micro-home first. Their I2 are different because there is a stakeholder originally rank freight bikes and micro-home first, but online shop and the use of spare capacity must modify weight to be ranked first. So under the same delta, the alternative with higher I1, lower I2 represents the better performance. When only consider I1 and delta radar can be generated. The 5 vertices of the pentagon represent I1. Through different delta value, the shape of pentagons are drawn from I1 equal to 1 to I1 equal to 5. The area of pentagons represents the effort to rank one alternative as the best solution. It has a similar meaning to the ranking step chart, which shows the effort of alternative to rank first among all stakeholders. In contrast, to show the detail of alternatives in each stakeholder group, this chart illustrates the overall view among all alternatives. After adding I2, a 3D chart is generated where x-axis represents I1, x-axis represents I2 and the y-axis represents delta. The dashed line shows the shortest distance for the alternatives I1 from lowest to highest. The purple line, urban warehouse and the electric vines, is first excluded as it can never reach consensus. For the other alternatives, the length of the dashed line represents the effort to rank one alternative as the best solution for all stakeholders. This chart puts the initial ranking in higher priority because I2 considers the initial state of alternatives. The MAMCA methodology can include multiple stakeholders in process of evaluation and decision-making. However, it is sometimes difficult to reach a consensus among all the stakeholders simultaneously for certain projects. By applying the MILP model into the MAMCA methodology, it can be easier for the decision makers or the analysts to find one or a limited set of possible candidates to reach a consensus solutions. By taking the inverse optimization point of view, one can find the smallest modification of weight allocation for one alternative and for all stakeholders to converge to a common acceptance solution. Several indicators are proposed to provide mathematical proof for the alternative's performance, and they are easy to understand and so to communicate with different stakeholders. This will help analysts to focus on their work on those options, but also give visual arguments that could be communicated to the stakeholders in order to reach a consensus. Furthermore, we proposed additional chart to inspect the model result from different perspectives. Still, we leave room for discussion instead of imposing a unique candidate for the consensus. Thanks for your listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I don't know if any questions from the audience in the chat. Well, I have a question. I'm not familiar with the MAMCA method, but well, I see you use the method Prometheus in you use the flows, negative and positive flows, but you commented something about other methods, ASP, to rank the alternatives before you apply the method.
No. So yeah, in MAMCA is the method, all the MCDM method can be used. So you can choose to use HP or Electra or Prometheus, but in this project, we applied Prometheus for the evaluation.
It's possible use another method?
Yes, it's possible.
Okay.
Yeah, but we don't use it in the same time. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
More questions? No?